Hello, this is Sheila Bender, and you're listening to In Conversation, discussions on writing and the writing life. Today we have with us in the studio Rachel Fordham. She lives on Marrowstone Island, where she is raising 6 children, and she also fosters children, as well as writing novels. She has long been fascinated by all things historical, or in the words of her children, old stuff. Often the historical trivia she discovers is woven into her children's bedtime tales. Despite her love for good stories, she didn't attempt writing a novel until her husband challenged her to do so, and now she's so glad he did, since she's written 3, one out recently, the one we'll talk about today, another one soon to come out, and a 3rd one under contract. Since that time, she's often been found typing or researching while her youngest child naps, or frantically she's writing plot twists while she waits in the school pickup line. In addition to her passion for storytelling, she enjoys reading, being outdoors, and seeing new places. Welcome to the program, Rachel.
Thanks for having me.
I'm so glad you're here. It's nice to be able to meet you in person. I've read about you in our newspaper, the Port Townsend Leader, and I've read about you in the Peninsula Daily News. And I am in awe. You've told me as we were walking into the studio that you're 34. You have 3 novels out. You've got more you're working on. You've got all these children. You live in an area that's beautiful and must be a wonderful, inspiring setting, but also makes some work for you.
It's very busy.
Yeah. We're going to talk about how you came to writing this challenge that your husband gave you, and we'll go from there. So maybe give us that story about his challenge.
So I've always been a reader, and I've always loved books, but I thought that writing was something that someone else did, someone less ordinary than me, someone who went to school for it. So it didn't really cross my mind that I could do that. And then when we started having kids, I read to them a lot, and then I started telling them stories, and they loved that. But I still didn't think that I could write a book. And my husband was really busy. Our kids were starting to get involved in things. And I was starting to feel like, I'd really love a creative outlet that still let me to put my kids first, because that's my number one. He said to me, well, why don't you take a class or something? And I said, well, our schedules are too busy. I can't fit that in. Like, they're too unpredictable. And so he said, well, you read so much. Why don't you write a book? And I said, yeah, I'm going to try to do that. Still without the goal of publishing. It was merely a hobby, something that I could try to do just to fill my time and kind of explore that love of storytelling and reading. And so I just took off, and it went so much better than I thought it would. And I kind of haven't, I haven't stopped since for life things that have happened, but I always go right back to it.
Is there a quiet time of day around your house when you can write?
So my very first manuscript, which is not this book, it's one that no one's seen. It actually takes place in Port Townsend, but I wrote it. I just had my 5th baby, and I would write from the time that my other kids went to bed until he woke up to eat at night. And so that was usually like 1 or 2 in the morning. And one night he didn't wake up at all. And so I just kept writing. And so I wrote at night. I try to utilize their napping during the day, things like that. But I also try to set really firm boundaries for myself. I try not to write when they need me, because I want that to still stay my number one.
I think the listeners might have the same question I do. Do you sleep?
Not enough.
I wouldn't know that looking at you.
I feel like I've always been someone who's been able to function on not very much sleep. And so honestly, the first time when I started writing, it was like an adrenaline rush. And so I was just almost had more energy than I'd had. It was so exciting. I couldn't wait to get back to it. And obviously, the more that I've done it, the adrenaline isn't quite exactly the same, but I still just love it. And so it's not hard to stay awake and do.
Wow. I think a lot of us writers better pay attention to that. Stay up late. Well, there is a book out called The Midnight Disease, and it is actually about writers who can't stop writing.
I might have to look into that.
You're in a particular genre right now. All the novels are being published by a publisher in Michigan called Revell. Uh-huh. You mentioned to me that they're clean reads. So we're going to hear you read an excerpt from the book, The Hope of Azure Spring. How did this become your genre, do you think?
I've always loved history, and I also really love people and relationships. And so it sort of just made sense to kind of put the two together. And so they're clean because I want my grandma to be able to read them and my kids to be able to read them. But that doesn't mean that I avoid like difficult topics. It just means that like I don't go into as much depth into that. If my characters have to do something behind closed doors, then the door gets closed, kind of things. And so you could read it without blushing. But that doesn't mean that I have skirted around things. I've just been tactful in how I tackle them.
So that interest in old stuff, as your kids call it, ends up in your books.
It does. So this book that's out has some history with the Orphan Trains, which I've always been fascinated by orphan stories, foster stories. And so my mom mentioned having read a book about orphan trains, and I just had to go research on the internet and read all about it. And so it just seemed like, oh, this makes sense to build a story around. I didn't realize at the time, because it was written a while ago, that it would become kind of a popular thing in stories right now. The second book that will be coming out, I was on vacation with my sister and we were touring an old post office, and they were talking about how if they couldn't find the owners to letters, they would send things to the dead letter office. And I was like, what is a dead letter office? And so the same kind of thing, I just started digging into that, and it just kind of fascinated me until a story started building itself. And I have a whole document that's full of ideas. So when something interesting pops up, I write it down, and if it ever starts to come alive in my head, I build a story around it.
Maybe this is a good time for us to hear the excerpt that you're prepared. Give us the title again.
Okay, so the title is The Hope of Azure Springs, and I wanted to pick something that was early in the story so that you're not finding out the end at the beginning. So in this particular part, our main characters are Caleb and Em. In the prologue, we find out that she was brought in injured to the town and welcomed by a family, the Howells, and they are taking care of her as she recovers from her injury. And Caleb is the sheriff, and he's gone to try and figure out what's happened. He kind of went back to where she'd come from to try to put the pieces together. And so he's come back from being out to her place and is going to kind of confront her on, try to figure out what's happening. Once seated, Caleb was ready for some answers. It wasn't every day that he found an old man hanging in a tree. The horror of finding him there came back to him. The revulsion he'd felt only spurred his need for answers. Like I said, I was out at your place. Took me the whole morning to find it. I did, though. The dugout was just a charred ruin. I searched inside and found nothing but an old table leg and a few bits of broken dishes, he said, his voice rising. You live there. You must know something about all of this. He brought his fist down hard on the table. They burned the place and you act like you know nothing. You've got to know something about all of this. Putting a finger to her lips, Em spoke. You'll wake the girls if you keep talking like that. You're right. I did live there. I lived there for nearly 7 years. I slept in the barn, fixed the man meals from whatever food I could find or that he brought in when he was around. We rarely spoke, and when we did, it was just about the laundry, the animals. I know nothing. Em pulled her long braid over her shoulder and twirled the end back and forth in her hand. I've no reason to keep anything from you. How did you end up there? Why of all places would you live there, in a barn? Was he a relative? Why wouldn't she tell him more? What does that have to do with any of this? Em snapped back at him. If I don't know the whole story, how am I supposed to figure this mess out? He set his hat on the table. Look, it's my job to keep this town safe. A person's dead. I found him swinging in a tree. You told me yourself that you were shot and left for dead. Everyone's at risk until I take care of this. So start thinking. He wrung his hands together. Swinging in a tree, she put a hand over her mouth. He was lying face down when I left. They were back. They know I'm gone. Who are they? Why do they care about an old man, and why would they care about me? She pressed a hand to her chest. Why would they care about a girl who's not much to look at? If I were a beauty, it might make sense. Is that it? Am I right? Yes, no, yes, I suppose. No, that's not what I mean. Caleb couldn't meet her eyes. Frustration filled him. This conversation was not going how he needed it to. An entire day spent on this, and he'd gotten nowhere, and now this, it was vexing. Em sucked her lip in and sat very still. He watched her, surprised by the look on her face. No longer expressionless, her face was marred in pain. He had never hurt anyone. Sure, he'd raised his voice from time to time, but she didn't need to fear him. Then he heard his words over in his mind. He'd said yes when he should have disagreed, but she'd been the one to label herself. He pressed his hands against his throbbing temple. I didn't mean what I said. It's just, you don't look like you've eaten enough in some time, that's all. He stood, pushed his hands into his pocket, and paced the room. I can go, and we'll talk about this another time. It's been a long day, and we aren't getting anywhere right now. How could I be so rude, he lamented as he continued to pace. No, she said quietly without meeting his gaze. Just sit down, and I'll try to help. She paused a moment before continuing, her voice quieter. I am plain. I got a good look at myself in the mirror the other day. Even with a few square mills in me, I'm still plain. I don't expect I'll ever be anything more. But I'm certain that's not what you came to talk about. Caleb wished he could put the words back in his mouth. He wished he hadn't agreed with her, even if there was a measure of truth to it all. He cleared his throat. There was no going back in time, so he pressed on. When I got to your place, the dugout was burned and George was swinging. He had been shot, just like you said. I cut him down and buried him. I marked the grave so you'll be able to find it. It's covered good, so there's no need to worry about animals. I'm pretty sure it was George, but just to be sure, did George have green eyes and a scar under his jaw? He ran a hand along his own square jaw. That's him. I often wondered where he'd earned that mark. You won't be asking him now. That man's dead and buried. My guess is there are quite a few questions that would have been easier to ask him when he was standing on his own 2 feet. Only I didn't know to ask them then. Thank you for burying him. It was the right thing to do, and I'm grateful. It wouldn't be fitting just leaving him. I can't say I enjoyed it, but it was my duty. She looked up then and found his eyes. Thank you. The barn was still standing. I found a few things in the loft. He reached in his pack and pulled out a nightshirt. She snatched it from him and tucked it on her lap under the table. Her downcast cheeks flushed a soft pink. Then he pulled out the sticks and set them on the table. Her pink cheeks turned crimson. She reached for one of the stick people, running her frail finger over the curve of the wood. He wanted her to look up. He hoped to be able to see something in her eyes. Moments passed, neither of them speaking. At last, he asked, was there anything else you were hoping to have? I looked but found nothing else. No, this is all. Making sure his voice was gentle, reminding himself that this was not just a crime to her, it was personal, he said, you say you were there for 7 years. Did you live in the barn that whole time, even through the winter? No one deserves such treatment. I did. It was not so unbearable when there were animals in there. The smell was bad, but they added some warmth. I imagine your time with the house has been a welcome change. Caleb wanted more answers, but something inside of him told him to tread softly. It has been indeed. I've spoken more in the last 4 days than in the last 7 years combined. How could I not with May and Millie around? It's strange to think I spent so many years wondering when I'd be able to leave and where I would go, only to suddenly find myself here in this beautiful house with the kindest people. Em brightened as she spoke. The blue of her eyes matched the color of the azurite the town displayed so fondly in the civic building. It's like a dream. I wish you could live the dream and not think of the past. He leaned towards her. Tell me, though, when George was gone, where did he go?
You talked about how I imagine this story comes to you and you start writing and you like writing.
Right.
And so does the story come in the form of the characters?
Well, it's not always the same every time. In the case of this book, I wanted to represent the orphan train and show, because in my research I found that there was good stories, bad stories, some kind of in the middle, and I kind of wanted to represent that all. And so I knew that I wanted Em to have had a less than perfect experience with her journey on the orphan train.
Maybe you should remind us what the orphan train was in history.
Yeah, so for like a 40 to 50 year period, over 200,000 children were taken from the cities and put on these trains and kind of taken out to the farm countries where they would try to find homes. My impression is that it had good intentions, although there was a lot of times when those children didn't end up in the best homes and had really rough lives. They actually didn't call them orphan trains back then. They were called mercy trains or baby trains because only probably half the children were actually orphans. A lot of them, their parents couldn't take care of them, or they were from a foundling home or something like that.
So Emma's, in her early life as a child, was on an orphan train.
Yeah, so relatively early in the book, you find out that she had ridden the train 7 years ago and ended up in this home. And so it's kind of trying to figure out her story and how to kind of have a future after her past. And so with this one, I knew I wanted to do the orphan train. I knew that I really wanted a heroine who wasn't your typical beautiful heroine. And so I knew that.
She says a number of times that she's plain.
Yes. And that's kind of a theme throughout, is sort of, what is beauty? Like, do we get to define it ourselves? Does it have to be what everyone tells us that it is? And so that was sort of a fun theme to explore. And because I didn't have publication in mind at the time that I wrote this, it was a message that I thought would be powerful for my daughter or my children to be reminded of what is really beauty. And so that's sort of woven in there. So I knew just a couple things going in, but they always joke around about people either being plotters or pantsers, where you write by the seat of your pants. And I very much fall into that category.
The pantser.
Yes. And so there was a lot of things I did not know when I started that I hope come together.
You are listening to KPTZ 91.9 FM, Port Townsend. In case you just joined us, you are listening to In Conversation with Sheila Bender, discussions on writing and the writing life. Sheila is talking with Marrowstone Island author Rachel Fordham about writing and publishing her first romance novel and then writing 2 more.
It's interesting to me that once you met the challenge that your husband gave you, you didn't stop.
Right.
And you've got a novel we haven't seen yet, the Port Townsend one, and 2 more that we will see.
Yes, I actually have a couple others as well.
Oh, wow.
So, yes.
Okay. So how did you learn to write? Was there some instruction involved eventually?
So I feel like I went to the school of reading. So I'd read a lot. The first one I just kind of started, and I learned the hard way, my first manuscript. And so I had to go back and I had to learn how to navigate this giant document. And if I made a change, like it changes in a story trickle throughout the whole story. And so it was really hard. So I kind of just learned as I went. I did better on this one because I knew more going in. I avoided some of the pitfalls.
Like, what are a pitfall?
Well, so the very first manuscript I wrote, I had my lead man have a certain profession, and I didn't research it as well as I should have. And his profession is woven throughout the entire book. And when I went to go research it, I realized that he was a fisherman, that they didn't fish the way that I envisioned him fishing. And it would have had him be gone way too often. And so I had to go change his whole profession, which basically means I had to change the entire document. I also didn't know how to write a timeline and kind of take note, mainly learning how to navigate it all. I'd never written anything that long. And so it's not that I couldn't make those changes, but to be able to find my way back and figure out how to keep it all consistent, and even just to kind of keep track of what was in my head and what was on the paper was a new thing for me.
I think it is for most of us in the first drafts.
Yeah.
So in this one, you have a sheriff. So did you research early about what his career would be
So
like?
this one, there was a lot of things that I researched better. I also learned how in my rough draft to pick a symbol that I'd stick in for the places that I need to go back and learn more. So I wasn't just blindly searching these documents. I could search for whatever symbol I put in and find the spots where I needed to edit or answer a question for myself or something like that.
You know, I often think of writing as done in layers. We make the best effort we can to get from the beginning to the end. Yeah. And then we have to look into it and see what do we have on our hands. So how do you approach revision in addition to looking for the inconsistencies and shaping up the characters to be more true? I
think everybody has their own style. The more that I've gotten to know writers, I realize that everybody kind of has something that works for them. For me, I don't worry about editing. I don't worry about anything on the first draft, really. It's more of almost like that's my plotting time. And this book is 85,000 words. I would just assume that my rough draft would be 65,000 words. And it's basically just the bare bones of a story. And so I usually do that first, and then I go back through and kind of flesh it out myself, and then I have my sisters read it.
Very good.
And now that I have a publisher, they are very involved in it.
Even the first draft?
Just with the idea development now.
So you have an editor there who talks you
so
talk
there's
with?
An editor. I have an agent. I have an editor, and then Revell has a whole crew. I mean, they have an acquisitions editor that does kind of the global, the big content edit. And then it goes to a project editor who does the line edits, has the paid proofreaders and multiple rounds of that. And I didn't know any of this going in. So it's definitely been a learn as I go experience. But
it's excellent because how would we know unless we're in that
But
tunnel?
I didn't know any of that going in. I mean, I'd never heard of a critique partner or a baiter. I've learned everything backwards. So I just wrote stories and now I'm like, ooh, there's all these things I could have utilized. So
well, now you are.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. When you talk about the global editor and then the line copy editor and your agent, did you find the agent and the agent found the publisher?
Yes. I'll just give you a brief timeline of how this book was written. So I started this book actually the summer of 2015, and it was going fantastic. It was just writing itself. It was like every writer's dream. And then my son got sick, and I just didn't even open my laptop for 5 months. And then I went back to it in, I think, November of that year. And I finished the story and then did a little bit of my own self-editing. And then I think it was early in 2016 that I went out to lunch with a friend who's a writer, and she said, well, why don't you query an agent? And I was like, yeah, maybe I should. And then I go home and have to Google, what does it mean to query an agent? Because I don't even know what that means. And it's telling me just write a letter and find agents and submit it to. And I had no idea that was something like a roadblock for a lot of people where they kind of get stopped in their journey. And so I just wrote a letter and I sent it in the next morning to a bunch of places. And so I kind of got lucky because I got 2 offers from that. Well, I got a couple requests for Fools and then 2 offers for representation. And then my agent basically said, we could probably take this to a small house and get you a deal really quickly. How fast do you need this published or want this published? What are your goals? And so I said, well, I didn't even know that it would end up published. So let's start bigger and work our way down. So she would just approach a couple houses at a time until we kind of landed where it fit well.
So this is a big publisher.
That took a while. It's not your big 5 or 4. I think one of them merged. I don't know. It's kind of just right below that. So
but you're happy with them.
I mean, it's in Barnes and Noble. It's everywhere books are sold, and they have marketing. They have publicists. They're fantastic. I'm really happy with them. Yeah.
That's good to know.
It's been a great experience. Yeah.
I love when you said I went to the school of reading. There are readers who learn the writing by osmosis. But then when you sit down to actually write, like you've started to talk about the gaps that you find you created a fisherman who really wouldn't have been that kind of fisherman.
Right.
What other kinds of gaps did you feel in your writing?
There was things that came natural to me and other things that I never thought about. So what I did after a little while is I went back to all my favorite books and I reread them almost like they were instruction manuals versus just enjoyable reads. And I asked myself, why did I like this? How did she get the message across? So I did that for a while. I just took a break from writing after my first manuscript and just read and read and read and tried to like look at it with a different eye, a writer's eye, and not just a reader's eye. And that was really helpful. Just all of it, like figuring out how to foreshadow and weave things in, the whole idea of show versus tell. I mean, I never like studied any of the like techniques of writing. A lot of it came natural because I'd read it so many times, but just to actually like stop and kind of really understand why things worked the way they did in writing.
But now you have some of the language, like foreshadowing.
Yes, I'm learning it. So it's like
show, don't tell.
Yes, it's like I've set myself through writing school.
Yeah. And you did a good job. You asked all the right questions. You were open to suggestions. Like
and I
you should
think,
look for an agent.
you know, I often people ask me what my advice would be to someone. And I don't think I could have written a novel at 25 or at 20 or probably even 28. Like, I don't think that I was humble enough to say, tell me what I'm doing wrong. Because it's hard at first when people say, this isn't very good. The first time that I submitted this, that it was submitted to Revell, I got a revise and resubmit, and they said that the dialogue sounded like Yoda. And my first instinct was to say, no, it doesn't. I couldn't write like Yoda if I wanted to write like Yoda. And so I read it out loud, and I didn't think it sounded bad. And then I had my husband read it, and I was like, oh, it does sound bad, because he wasn't putting the inflection where I was putting it. And so he was reading it differently than me. And so I had to be able to say, you know what, I'm going to revise that dialogue. I'm going to redo that. And so I think that to new writers, aspiring writers, it doesn't mean you're weak if you have to ask someone, like, what do you think about this? And with my sisters and other people that read them, I'm like, you really, like, tell me if there's loose ends. Tell me if this character is not likable. And
well, one of the things I noticed as you were reading in the dialogue, you add in gestures. The sheriff puts his hat on the table. M touches her face and chest. So is that something that came naturally, or was that part of revising the dialogue?
A lot of that stuff was already in there. I'd kind of figured out how to put in beats, I think is what they call them. And most of that came pretty natural. I think that my problem was that the way that I read things in my head isn't always the way that other people do. And so I kind of had to read it myself out loud, and even ask my husband to read certain parts out loud to realize that other people kind of have a different rhythm to how they read things.
You mean the reader? Other
readers have different rhythm, and so it needs to work kind of for everyone.
Yeah,
universally.
But when you're writing, you can't really think of everyone. But
as many people as you can, I guess. So.
But you're learning the right things from the other people, because that's the other thing. If you can get very confused if you listen to everyone about not the right things.
There definitely has to be there are suggestions that I've gotten that I've had to say, no, I'm not going to take that one. But for the most part, the more open-minded I am, the more it'll at least make me pause and ask myself the right questions and think about why they said that. And so it's been helpful.
You're doing it all right. You could have gone to school in writing to learn all that, but you didn't have to. You're gifted with plot. It sounds like every writer seems to have a real strength, and some are plot, some is dialogue. People will write dialogue and then need a plot. So
I would say my bigger strength would be like emotions and character growth. But yeah, it's fun to see it all come together. And there's definitely parts where I have to say, help me more on this.
Right. Are you getting any fan mail from people who have read the book?
So it's only been out for 2 weeks today. Oh. And yeah, the reviews have been really good. I think the most touching one I've gotten is from a woman who emailed me and said that she felt like it helped her marriage. She said, because my character is sort of plain, and she said that her husband made a comment when they were first married about how he wasn't initially attracted to her, and that it just had bothered her for a really long time. And she said that she felt like when she read this story, she understood what he was actually trying to say. And
how valuable for you.
Was like, well, there we go. It has a purpose.
Absolutely. That's rewarding. Well, you've had a lot of rewards along the way.
It's been really nice.
Yeah. Before we close, sometimes when someone has success, and I know it's not the first thing you wrote, but this is the first one published. Right. And then they go back into their writing or try to create the next thing, that it's a scary proposition. It's like, will I be able to do this again? Are you finding any of that?
Yeah, it makes me really nervous when I read through reviews or things where they say, I can't wait to see what she wrote next, because I've never written with pressure before. I think one of the nice things is that my next books are already written, and so they kind of are what they are, and they're already accepted, they're already under contract. It is on my mind, and I want people to really like them.
It's
We'll
part
just
of the
see.
process. It's just
Yeah,
to
there's
get
a lot
used
of
to it.
things I'm learning. You know, I mean, before I had a publisher, I just sat down and wrote a book, and now I'm learning how to write a book, market a book, and I have another one in editing, and I'm supposed to be writing new stuff, and so it's definitely changing.
You're definitely
The
in the writing
experience,
life.
but it's fun and rewarding, and it's just like a new challenge. Just like learning all of these things was, learning how to balance it all is fun too.
So it sounds like
I'll
the same
master it.
skill that allows you to raise so many children is allowing you to raise so many books.
I think I just have like a stubborn streak in me that if I'm going to raise a kid, I'm going to do everything I can to do it right. And if I'm going to write a book, I'm not going to stop halfway through. I'm going to give it what I can.
Yeah.
So
Well, you've given us a wonderful excerpt, and you've given us a wonderful account of how you came to write books and where you are now in the process. And so you've sprinkled in some pretty good advice for other writers. Is there any more advice you want to leave us with?
I guess mostly if you love it, keep at it, because I think of my book and I think if the whole purpose of this book was to help this one woman's relationship be better, then I was successful. And so my definition of success doesn't have to match anyone else's. And so if it's making your life better and it's exciting for you, then just keep at it and it'll get to wherever it's supposed to go.
That's very, very good advice. Yeah. So I want to thank you so much for being with us in the studio. It's a pleasure to meet you in person.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And to hear the story. And I want to direct people to your website, which is your name,
RachelFordham.com.
And we'll spell it.
Yeah. Rachel. It's Rachel. And then Fordham, Fordham.com.
And there's a lot going on the website. There's excerpt of the book, I think, and there's a wonderful about you. And you'll learn a lot about the friendliness and openness of Rachel Fordham. And I think you'll get enthused too, not only about reading her books, but about writing and about life. And so you do a little bit of blogging on that website too.
Yeah. Not on any specific schedule. It's kind of sporadic, but yeah.
Well, maybe that's the best way to blog.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks again so much.
Thank you.
In Conversation is produced by Sheila Bender and edited by Charlie Fleischman.